Knock, knock. Who's there? Athens. Oh no, it's the polis. Get it? Mm, maybe not the greatest knock, knock joke, but it's okay. How about this joke? Spartan and Athenian were having a debate over whose city state was better. So the Athenian says, well, let's have a vote to decide whose is better. And the Spartan says, okay, I vote for Sparta. And the Athenian says, okay, I vote for Athens. And then the Spartan pulls his wife to the side and says, who do you vote for, honey? And she says, I vote for Sparta. And then the Athenian's wife turns to the Athenian and says, I don't get to vote. I like that joke. That one's funny. Um, so, oh gosh, my neighbor turned on their leaf blower. I am trying to teach. These people so inconsiderate of sixth grade social studies. You're just turning on the leaf blower right in the middle of my lesson. Oh well, I'm just gonna have to talk over it. All right, so in the last video I talked about some basic information about Athens and Sparta and how they're different from each other. In this video, I'm going to talk about the differences between Athens and Sparta and how they led to political changes in Greece. So basically, we know that all the Greek city-states, at first they started off as kingdoms, but over the centuries, there are a lot of changes that happened that moved them either towards democracies like Sparta, like Athens had, or towards oligarchies like Sparta had. So as the populations of these city-states became larger, it became harder for one person or one royal family to rule. So this leans in favor of forming democracies because the more people you have under your authority, the harder it is to control all of these people. Right? Now, this by itself is not enough to shift a government away from a tyranny or a kingdom or an oligarchy into a democracy, but it does put some pressure to change into a democracy. So before becoming a democracy, most of the Greek city-states like Athens actually did have a brief time as oligarchies, meaning, remember, they're ruled by a class of aristocrats. So this is where people like Solon come from. So in the beginning, the oligarchies were made up of aristocrats who were wealthy landowners. But as the city-states became more wealthy, there were a lot of merchants who started to become very rich. Right? Now remember, merchants were the third ranking class in Greek society. So they weren't even like the second rank class, they were the third rank class. But as these merchants and businesses and artisans start to become really rich, they start to have more power and they can pressure the government of their city-state to do things that they want. Also, another thing that happened is that, well, actually, I'll get to that in the next slide. All right, so how do oligarchies work? Remember, oligarchies are groups of aristocrats who basically have all the power. What happened under a lot of oligarchies was that these aristocrats would appoint a council of leaders that would make laws that would benefit other aristocrats at the expense of people who are not aristocrats, so poor people. So there were actually a lot of laws that punished people who were poor. So it said if you owe money and you don't pay it back, you have to be a slave, or you're thrown in prison, or sometimes you're even killed. Okay, so there's a very famous writer named Plutarch. The writings of Plutarch are what make it possible for us to study ancient Sparta and ancient Athens. Um, so Plutarch's writings help to show us uh, what kinds of vices and virtues existed in Greek government, right, and how they worked. Okay, another reason that city states started to move away from oligarchy and towards democracy was the development of something called the phalanx. So, a phalanx is a tight formation of highly trained soldiers. Right, so, basically, I included a picture of a phalanx here. This is from the movie 300. So, the way a phalanx would work is instead of fighting as an individual soldier, you fight as part of a unit of soldiers that move their swords and shields and spears in a controlled, organized way. So basically, you'd have a bunch of soldiers lined up really close to each other, and then their shields would overlap. So your shield is covering part of you and part of the person next to you. And a person on the other side of you, their shield is covering part of them and the part of you that is exposed. Right? So the phalanx has very coordinated movements, and a well-trained phalanx is very difficult to stop on the battlefield. It's kind of like a tank. Right? Now, why does this lead to the development of democracy? Well, because the soldiers who are part of the phalanx were members of the lower classes, right? Uh, People who were poor were the foot soldiers in these Greek city-state armies, and they were trained in how to operate a phalanx on the battlefield. All you needed to do to be part of a phalanx was to have a sword and a shield. So you didn't have to be rich. If you were wealthy, then you had a horse. You had other armor, right? You might have received advanced military training, so you'd be more like an officer. If you're a foot soldier, all you have to do is have a sword and a shield, and you can be part of a phalanx. So it attracted a lot of lower class soldiers. Um, and when the phalanx started to be used heavily in battle, it became a very important feature of the battle and very advantageous for whoever had the best phalanx. So, why does this lead to the development of democracy? Well, because these lower class soldiers started to realize just how important they were in battle. And so they demanded better laws from their government leaders. So they would say, hey, if you don't pass laws that reduce our taxes or that help our families to become wealthier, then we're not going to participate in the next battle, right? And this sort of threat or pressure could be enough to cause the city state to lose a battle. And they're not willing to lose a battle, so they just gave in to what the phalanx wanted. Right? Another reason the phalanx was important is because it made the Greek city-state armies extremely difficult to defeat. So foreign invaders, if they encountered a phalanx, it was really tough to beat a phalanx. Now, the movie 300, which I think is awesome, but it's not historically accurate. But one thing that it does do very well is it shows how a phalanx can be used in combination with Greece's geography. So remember, Greece has very rocky and hilly terrain. Right? A phalanx is a well-trained phalanx is a really big advantage for fighting in this terrain, because what you can do is you can basically go into the mountains with your phalanx and you can completely block a roadway, right? So an invading army they're narrowed by this mountainous terrain, right? So you can't just send like a wave of soldiers against the phalanx. You actually have to narrow your attack, and then you go straight into the phalanx, which is kind of like a well-trained wall, and it kills all your soldiers. Right? So it made the Greek city-states even harder to invade. Okay, so phalanx becomes more important. The city-states become more dependent on these common soldiers in battle, and so they demand more of their leaders in politics. Um, so this means that the leaders are going to start paying attention to what members of the lower classes want. And this weakens the oligarchies, and strengthens, or at least moves, the city-state in the direction towards democracy. Right? So as the phalanx becomes more important, as the citizens, lower class citizens, become wealthier, they insist on having a bigger role in government. So this leads to two results. It could lead to a tyranny, or it could lead to a democracy. Now, how would this lead to a tyranny? This could happen if one person in the aristocracy notices that the commoners are very unhappy with the oligarchy. So the aristocrat could go to these commoners and win their support. Be like, yeah, the oligarchy is terrible. These aristocrats, they're really dumb. They think you're weak and you don't matter, right? I want to overthrow them. And if you get the support of these wealthy lower class people on your side, or these members of a phalanx unit on your side, then you have pretty significant backup if you try to overthrow the oligarchy. Right? So these tyrants would kind of ride a wave of popular support to the throne. Now, tyrants would try to set up family dynasties to ensure that their sons and grandsons could continue to rule after it, but dynasties rarely worked in ancient Greece. Usually, what would happen is after the tyrant would take power, the poor would realize, oh, he was just using us to become a tyrant, right? Or the tyrant would fail to keep whatever promises he made to these lower class supporters, and these tyrants would lose support. And actually, sometimes, as soon as they became a tyrant, the lower classes would rebel against them and overthrow them. But if a tyrant was a good ruler and pleased the lower classes, then often he got to keep his position for a long time. Now, I said the growing power of the lower classes could lead to tyrannies, but it could also lead to democracy, right? So we learned that Solon was an aristocrat who recognized that the lower classes needed representation in government. So Solon was the first person to make Athens shift towards democracy. So Athens became the first city-state to experiment with democracy. Solon changed laws that hurt the poor, right? So he said, for example, if you're poor and you don't pay off your debts, you're not allowed, you can't be sold into slavery, right? That's like an extreme reaction to not being able to pay off your debts. Solon also created laws that limited the amount of land that people could own, and he did this to try to prevent any single person from becoming really wealthy. Right? So he thought it's better that everyone be kind of poor to like moderately wealthy than to have like a small handful of people who own everything. That'd be really bad for the city-states. Solon also ended the practice of serfdom. So this means that you can't be a slave to the person you owe money to. And he also reduced punishment for crime. So he said, for example, all right, if you're really poor and your family's starving and you steal something, you can't be executed for that. Right? So he made life easier on the lower classes. Solon also said all male citizens have the right to vote. That was his idea. All right, so Athens also became democratic because of the idea of citizenship, which developed in Athens. If you are a citizen, this means you are an official member of your political community. Right? So some citizens have more rights than others, but by creating citizenship, it was like an additional class that opened up. Right? So poor people could be citizens just like wealthy people. So citizenship is important because it creates a distinction between people who have membership as a political being in the city-state, and it distinguishes them from people who don't have membership in the city-state. Okay, I will stop there. The next video will be about Athens specifically and how Athens developed its democracy.